All right, so in this video, we're going to use a little bit of art to kind of review where we were at the end of time period 2 and introduce some of the big ideas of time period 3. So we're going to use this art stuff as a little bit of review and a little bit of introduction to where we're going. So when we were last doing stuff, we had just finished off the French Revolution and the reign of Napoleon in France, and the art movement of the late 19th century is called Neoclassicism. So neo meaning new, classicism meaning classical Greece and Rome. So this is kind of a resurgence of Greek and Roman artistic styles. And I'll show you a few examples of these as we go, but it's basically the stuff from maybe the Renaissance kind of becoming popular again towards the end of the 1700s and the beginning of the 1800s. So we're going to see a lot of Greek and Roman stuff. And if there's one name that you need to know that completely typifies the neoclassical style, it's this guy. His name is Jacques Louis David. Jacques Louis David. He is a one-man neoclassical artistic movement all by himself. Jacques Louis David. He was kind of the artistic director, and I'll put that in quotation marks because it wasn't an official position, but he was like the artistic director of the French Revolution. So any time that the leaders of the revolution needed a piece of propaganda, Jacques Louis David was the guy that they went to. And a lot of the art that he produced is directed at the French people. A lot of neoclassical art and a lot of David's art has a political message, or maybe to put it more nicely, a civic message. There's a lot of stuff about duty and oaths and responsibilities, which, if you remember back to our discussions of the French Revolution, a lot of the French Revolution was devoted towards things like duty and oaths and responsibilities. So this is all kind of the art style of the Enlightenment. It's very logical. It's very rational. That's the point. Neoclassicism is the art style of the Enlightenment. It is the art style of the French Revolution. So let's look at a few pieces. So the paintings I'm going to show you here are all pieces by David. This one is not about the French Revolution, but it's definitely about oaths and honor. So this is a story from, I believe it's a Roman story. And this, and I'll move the painting out of the way in a second. This painting is called the Oath of the Harashii. And the story is that these three brothers had to go fight in a battle, and they're all taking an oath to go fight. And this is their father, who is taking the oath and then handing them their swords. So if you remember back to the ideas of the French Revolution, there is a lot of duty and honor involved, and this kind of painting is meant to reflect that, the Oath of the Harashii. Here's another one, and we actually looked at this because this is David's drawing of the tennis court oath. So this is the tennis court oath. This is actually in the tennis court. So again, there is a lot of stuff here about oaths and honor. And then finally, David survived all the stuff of the revolution. And here we have one of the big propaganda paintings of Napoleon's time in power. This one is called Napoleon Crossing the Alps. There are a number of things that are wrong with this painting. For one, Napoleon crossed the Alps. So he actually did cross the Alps to go fight the Austrians, but he didn't do it while riding on a magnificent white stallion. He crossed the Alps on a donkey. And apparently, I'm no horseman myself, but apparently you're not supposed to raise your heels while you're in the saddle because you'll fall off. And Napoleon is doing that. Now, Napoleon wouldn't have done that, but David probably didn't know that. And so it just looks cool. But again, this is all about a political or a civic message, that Napoleon is our guy. And this looks very Greek or Roman. So these three paintings, very, very representative of the stuff of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, because they are kind of resurrecting, we'll say, Greek and Roman stuff from the Renaissance. The only difference here is that the Renaissance use of Greek and Roman stuff wasn't used for a purpose. It was just to make art. This is using the Greek and Roman stuff to transmit a message. Now, the other thing that we'd want to note about neoclassical art is that there's a lot of neoclassical architecture of the time. So if we take a second and look at architecture, neoclassical architecture is going to look like Greek or Roman temples. So there's going to be lots of columns and domes, you know, like you'd see in a Greek or a Roman temple. Now, the best examples of these are probably American, because if you look at something like the Capitol building, or the White House, which were both products of the Enlightenment and the American Revolution, it's all in the same general milieu. It's all happening at roughly the same time. So the Capitol building and the White House, definitely examples of neoclassical architecture. It's not really going to help us in this class. So for us, I'm going to direct you to this building in Paris called the Pantheon. Now, the Pantheon is it's a tomb for France's greatest people. So, for example, Voltaire is buried here. Rousseau is buried here. Lots of other really important French people who we probably won't really get to know too well, but there's lots of famous French people buried in the Pantheon. And here is what the Pantheon looks like. So it looks like a Greek or a Roman temple. You've got the columns here, you've got the dome, you've got more columns down here. It's this giant building on top of a hill in the middle of Paris. And it's meant to look like a Greek or a Roman temple. Now, as we move away from the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, the ideas of the French Revolution become, we'll say, unpopular afterwards. And so, really, we're talking about ideas of the Enlightenment. So, what ends up happening is that the Enlightenment becomes associated with the violence and the bloodshed of the French Revolution. And so Neoclassicism falls out of popularity. And so this is kind of where time period 3 starts for us in our course on European history. So Neoclassicism is gone, and it's replaced by a new art movement called Romanticism. So if Neoclassicism is all about logic and reason, Romanticism is a resurgence of emotional art. So it's emotional art. If Neoclassicism is about your duty to others, Romanticism is about your duty to yourself. It's about individualism. And so this pendulum is swinging back in the other direction. So what we're going to see in Romanticism is a connection to nature. And we're going to see kind of a nostalgia for maybe medieval Europe, when things weren't so logical. So it's kind of a look back towards maybe the 13 or the 1400s, when things were a lot simpler. A simpler time. A time that is not quite so complicated like the revolutionary period of Europe. This period is much more simple. So let's look at a few pieces of art. Maybe the most famous piece of Romantic art is this one called The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. This one is by believe he's Austrian, Caspar David Friedrich. And of course, I didn't write down the dates, but let's say this is in the 1820s. That kind of makes sense. So here is the painting. It's a very famous painting. You've probably seen this before. So unlike the stuff in the neoclassical art movement, this art is not really focused on the guy. You don't even see his face. It's impersonal. He's a part of nature. And you're not quite sure why he's even there. Is he scared? Is he triumphant? So there's kind of a blank slate for you to kind of impose your own emotional feelings on this guy. Why is he up there? What is he doing? There's also a sense that he is both superior to nature but also powerless in front of it. Powerless. Like he has got this kind of superior position above the natural world, but it's vast. And he's all there by himself. If there's any one painter that kind of typifies the Romantic movement, it might be this guy, Francisco Goya. I'm going to show you two works of art from Goya. So the first one is kind of a response to the political themes of Neoclassicism. So this painting, and I'll pull it down and write down the name of it first, is called the 3rd of May, 1808. That's the name of the painting. And this painting depicts the execution of Spanish rebels against the French occupiers. And again, even though it's a political painting, you get this same sense that you got from the Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, right? So you've got one figure. Your eye is drawn towards this person, just like your eye is drawn towards this guy. And both this guy and this guy are facing insurmountable odds. There's no, this guy can't beat nature. This guy is about to be executed. They are facing unbeatable odds. And that's kind of the idea of the romantic hero. Somebody who stands in the face of unbeatable odds and stands there regardless. So you've got this figure who fights a hopeless battle. And it's meant to make you feel something. It's meant to make you feel an emotional appeal, not towards the French, who you don't even see their faces. They're like nature in this case. You identify with the underdog. You identify with this guy. Now, in a completely different vein, Goya also painted scenes of just utter emotional despair. Towards the end of his life, Goya painted on the walls of his house, and this is one of these paintings. So he painted this on the wall of the house he was living in, and it's meant to elicit the kind of deep despair he found himself in at the end of his life. And this is a Greek myth. So this is Saturn, or I guess Roman, Saturn eating one of his children because he was told that one of his children would kill him, and so he ate all of his children. And so you get this kind of desperation in the eyes of Saturn eating his child. Saturn devouring his child. So again, we get this emotional art. Like you can feel the fear, you can feel the anxiety in that piece of art that Goya painted. I'll give you one more, because this is going to be kind of a transition to the last piece, or the last art movement we'll talk about here. And this is a painting by a painter named Eugene Delacroix. And this one is called Liberty Leading the People. And again, this is a very famous piece of art. It hangs in the Louvre. It is giant. It is like 20 feet by 30 feet. This takes up almost a whole wall of the Louvre. But again, you get this sense of the people fighting against some sort of overwhelming force. That liberty here is leading the people against some kind of overwhelming force. You can't tell what it is, but you know that it's something that's deadly because you've got a lot of dead bodies down here. So liberty leading the people, one more piece of romantic art. Now, as the 19th century moves along, romantic art is going to kind of shift. It shifts into something that is called, before we do that, let's talk about a little bit of literature. So, romantic heroes are a big part of literature in this period, and perhaps no figure better exemplifies the romantic hero other than Victor Frankenstein himself. So Victor Frankenstein and other romantic heroes, they fight against nature, or they fight against the system. They're usually alone. They're usually seen as sullen or melancholy. They're prone to self-reflection. Batman is usually thought of as a romantic hero if you start to analyze comic books. But Victor Frankenstein is probably the time period specific romantic hero. Now, Romanticism is eventually going to shift into a kind of similar art movement called realism. And this is going to happen kind of about the 1850s. So we get realism around the 1850s. Now, it's going to look very similar. So it looks similar to Romanticism. But without the kind of grand emotional appeals. It really is meant to reflect real life. Hence, realism. So instead of seeing like the grand figures or the big moments in history, we see regular people doing regular stuff. So I'm going to show you a couple examples of this. Maybe the best example of a realist painting is called The Gleaners. And The Gleaners is by Jean-Francois Millet. Now, a gleaner is somebody who kind of goes over a field that's been harvested and picks up individual pieces of grain. So most of the food has been harvested, but the gleaners go back over it and pick up individual pieces of food, and they make their food that way. So here is the gleaners, and that's what these people are doing. They're picking up individual pieces of grain, probably wheat, and putting it into their pockets. And that's how they would sustain themselves. Real life. It doesn't sugarcoat things. It doesn't make them look better than they actually are. But it does kind of give you the same sense that the Romantic paintings do. So this one is 1853. Here's another one. So this one is called The Stonebreakers. It's going to give you a similar sense. Gustave Courbet, 1849. Here's this one. I bring this one up because this painting was actually destroyed during World War II. It was being moved by the Germans, and it was blown up by the Allies as it was being moved from one vault to another, and it happened to be the accidental target of an Allied bombing raid. So this painting doesn't exist anymore, except as a picture file on the computer. But again, you get the sense of regular people doing regular work. And then one more that is going to bring up regular work that was always kind of looked down upon. It was always kind of on the fringes of society. This one is called Olympia, and it is by a well-known artist named Edouard Manet. So Olympia is a prostitute. And prostitutes were usually not the subject of high art. I mean, they were always, pornographic pictures that prostitutes would be depicted in, but they were never really the subject of high art until we get into the mid to late 19th century, in which case artists wanted to depict real life and prostitution, which had always been a part of real life. Manet wanted to depict a prostitute because prostitutes were part of regular life. And so here is Olympia. Okay, so big picture. What are we seeing here? We're seeing a shift from the logic and reason of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution into a period of more emotional art. This coincides, Romanticism and Realism are going to coincide with the Industrial Revolution. And so eventually this realism stuff is going to depict industrial work. We haven't really looked at any yet because we haven't really covered the Industrial Revolution. But this stuff is going to be the artistic background to the Industrial Revolution and all of the radical, rapid changes that occur because of the Industrial Revolution. And our next series of videos will start in on the different thematic scopes of the Industrial Revolution, which is going to turn Europe from a backwater into something that is going to take over the world. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.